You're standing in a sterile medical examination room at 3 in the morning, looking at a man who will be dead in 18 hours. He's asking you to do something that could destroy your medical career, something that goes against every protocol you've ever learned. But what he's telling you about the children he left behind will force you to choose between following the rules and following your heart. This is the story of Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a prison medical officer who thought she was conducting a routine pre-execution health assessment. What she discovered about the man sitting across from her would challenge everything she believed about justice, redemption, and the power of a mother's love to transcend even the darkest circumstances. Before we dive into this incredible story that will restore your faith in human compassion, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more stories that will touch your soul, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Trust me, what happens in this examination room will stay with you long after the video ends. Dr. Elena Rodriguez had been working as a medical officer at Riverside State Penitentiary for 7 years. At 38, she was one of the most respected physicians in the correctional system, known for her professionalism, her compassion for patients regardless of their crimes, and her unwavering commitment to medical ethics. Elena had not intended to work in a prison. After completing her residency in emergency medicine, she had planned to work in a hospital, saving lives in trauma centers and emergency rooms. But life had taken her down a different path when her younger brother Miguel had been incarcerated for drug possession. Visiting him in prison had opened her eyes to the deplorable state of medical care available to inmates. She had taken the position at Riverside with the goal of making a difference, of ensuring that incarcerated individuals received the same quality of medical care as anyone else. It was challenging work, both emotionally and professionally, but Elena found deep satisfaction in treating patients who had been abandoned by society. On this particular Tuesday evening in March, Elena was working a double shift to cover for a colleague who had called in sick. The night had been relatively quiet until she received a call from the prison administration requesting her immediate presence in the medical wing for a pre-execution examination. The inmate scheduled for execution the following morning was Thomas Bennett, a 34-year-old man convicted of murdering 2 people during an armed robbery 8 years earlier. Elena had reviewed his medical file earlier that day, noting that he had no significant health issues that would prevent the state from carrying out his sentence. But protocol required a final medical examination within 24 hours of execution to ensure the condemned prisoner was physically and mentally competent to face his punishment. It was a grim responsibility that Elena had performed 12 times in her 7 years at Riverside, and she had never gotten used to it. The medical examination room was located in the secure wing of the prison, accessible only to authorized medical personnel and accompanied by armed guards. Elena gathered her medical bag and the necessary paperwork, steeling herself for what was always the most difficult part of her job. Thomas Bennett was already waiting in the examination room when Elena entered, seated on the metal examination table with his hands cuffed to a chain around his waist. 2 corrections officers stood guard by the door, their presence a constant reminder of the security protocols surrounding death row inmates. Elena's first impression of Thomas surprised her. She had expected to see the hardened criminal described in his file, someone whose eyes reflected the violence he had committed. Instead, she saw a man who looked younger than his 34 years, with gentle brown eyes and an expression of profound sadness that seemed to radiate from deep within his soul. "Good evening, Mr. Bennett," Elena said professionally, settling into her chair and opening his medical file. "I'm Dr. Rodriguez. I need to conduct a routine medical examination before tomorrow morning." Thomas nodded quietly, his voice barely above a whisper when he responded. "Thank you for coming so late, Doctor. I know this isn't easy for anyone." Elena was struck by his politeness. his consideration for her comfort even in his final hours. In her experience, death row inmates facing execution typically fell into one of two categories: those who raged against their fate and those who had retreated into themselves completely. Thomas seemed to be neither. There was an alertness in his eyes, a presence that suggested he was fully engaged with his circumstances despite their finality. "I'm going to check your vital signs, ask you some questions about how you're feeling, and ensure that you're physically prepared for tomorrow," Elena explained, beginning her routine examination. Thomas's blood pressure was slightly elevated, which was normal given the circumstances. His heart rate was steady, his breathing clear. Physically, he was a healthy young man who showed no signs of the mental breakdown that sometimes occurred in inmates facing imminent execution. "Mr. Bennett, how are you feeling emotionally?" Elena asked, a standard question designed to assess his mental state. "Are you experiencing any anxiety, depression, or thoughts of self-harm?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his brown eyes focusing on something beyond the walls of the examination room. "I'm scared, doctor," he said finally. "Not of dying exactly, but of what I'm leaving behind. Of the people I'm failing by dying this way." Elena made notes in his file, but something in his tone made her look up from her paperwork. "Can you tell me more about that?" she asked, though the question went beyond the standard psychiatric evaluation. Thomas's eyes filled with tears, though he fought to maintain his composure. "I have 2 daughters, doctor. Emma is 9 years old, and Sophia is 7. They live with my ex-wife about 3 hours from here. They don't know their father is in prison, and they certainly don't know he's going to be executed tomorrow morning." Elena felt her heart constrict. She had read in Thomas's file that he had children, but the clinical documentation hadn't conveyed the emotional reality of what that meant. 2 little girls who were about to lose their father, possibly without ever understanding why. "What does your ex-wife plan to tell them?" Elena asked, though she knew she was straying from the medical examination into personal territory. "Maria told them I was sick, that I was in a special hospital getting better. For 8 years, she's been taking them to visit me here, telling them this was where sick people got treatment. The girls think I have some kind of illness that keeps me away from home." Elena realized the extraordinary lengths Thomas's ex-wife had gone to protect their children from the truth about their father's crimes and imprisonment. For 8 years, Maria had maintained an elaborate fiction to preserve her daughter's innocence and their relationship with their father. Tomorrow morning, Maria is going to have to tell Emma and Sophia that their daddy's illness finally got too bad, that he died peacefully in his sleep thinking about how much he loved them. Thomas's voice broke completely now, tears streaming down his face as he continued. "But here's the thing, doctor. I won't die peacefully in my sleep. I'll die strapped to a gurney with chemicals flowing through my veins, surrounded by strangers and guards and witnesses who came to watch justice being served. Maria will have to lie to our daughters for the rest of their lives about how their father died." Elena felt tears threatening her own eyes as she listened to Thomas describe the impossible situation his family faced. She had never considered the collateral damage of executions, the way they affected not just the condemned but the innocent family members left behind. "Mr. Bennett," she said carefully, "what are you asking of me?" Thomas met her eyes directly, and Elena saw in them a desperation that went far beyond fear of death. "I'm asking you to help me die the way my daughters need me to die," he said quietly. "I'm asking you to help me find a way to make Maria's story true." Elena felt the room spinning around her as she realized what Thomas was suggesting. He wasn't asking for a reprieve or a commutation of his sentence. He wasn't asking her to help him escape or contact the media. He was asking her to participate in creating a fiction that would allow his daughters to grieve their father's death with dignity rather than shame. "I don't understand what you're asking me to do," Elena said, though she suspected she understood all too well. Thomas leaned forward as much as his restraints would allow, his voice taking on an urgency that made Elena's skin crawl with its implications. "The medical examiner will conduct an autopsy after my execution. The cause of death will be listed as lethal injection, but autopsy reports aren't public records. The only people who will see the official cause of death are law enforcement officials and medical personnel." Elena began to see where Thomas was leading, and the destination terrified her. "My daughters will never see the autopsy report," Thomas continued. "They'll never know the medical details of how I died. All they'll know is what their mother tells them. And if there was a way for the official story to match Maria's story, if there was a way for the records to show that I died peacefully of natural causes rather than by execution." "You're asking me to falsify medical records," Elena said, her voice barely audible. "I'm asking you to help two little girls grow up without the burden of knowing their father was executed by the state." Thomas replied, "I'm asking you to help them remember me as someone who fought an illness bravely rather than someone who committed terrible crimes and paid the ultimate price." Elena stood up abruptly, pacing to the small window that looked out onto the prison yard. The request was impossible, unethical, illegal. Falsifying medical records was a felony that would end her career and potentially land her in prison herself. But as she looked back at Thomas, seeing the desperate love of a father who wanted to protect his children even in death, Elena found herself considering the impossible. "Even if I wanted to help you," she said slowly, "which I'm not saying I do, it would be impossible. Too many people are involved in an execution. The warden, the guards, the witnesses, the medical examiner. I couldn't change the official record without dozens of people knowing the truth." Thomas nodded sadly. "I know it's impossible, Doctor. I know what I'm asking is crazy. But I had to ask because I love my daughters more than I love my own life, and I can't bear the thought of them growing up knowing what kind of man their father really was." As Elena looked at this man who was going to die in less than 18 hours, she realized that Thomas Bennett had just presented her with the most difficult ethical dilemma of her medical career. Not whether to save a life, but whether to help a father die in a way that would protect his children's innocence. The clock on the wall ticked steadily toward dawn, toward an execution that would end one life and forever change the lives of two little girls who had no idea what was coming. And Elena Rodriguez, prison doctor, mother of two children herself, had to decide whether compassion or protocol would guide her actions in the hours that remained. What would you do if someone asked you to choose between your professional oath and protecting two innocent children? That's the impossible position Elena found herself in as she stared at Thomas Bennett, a man whose love for his daughters was about to ask her to risk everything she had worked for. Elena returned to her chair, her mind racing through the implications of what Thomas had asked. In her 7 years at Riverside, she had encountered every type of inmate imaginable. Violent criminals who showed no remorse, mentally ill individuals who needed treatment more than punishment, and everything in between. But she had never met someone whose final request was designed not to save himself, but to protect his children from the truth about who he was. "Tell me about Emma and Sophia," Elena said, abandoning her clinical examination completely. "What are they like?" Thomas's face transformed when he spoke about his daughters. The sadness remained, but it was joined by a warmth and pride that made him look like any other devoted father. "Emma is 9, And she's incredibly smart. She wants to be a doctor, just like you. She reads everything she can get her hands on about medicine and science. Last month, Maria brought her to visit me, and Emma spent the entire hour explaining to me how the human heart works. She had memorized every chamber, every valve. Elena felt her own heart breaking as she imagined this little girl who wanted to follow in her footsteps, who had no idea her father was on death row. Sophia is 7, and she's the artist of the family. She draws pictures for me every week, usually of our family doing things together. Going to the beach, having picnics, playing in the park, things we've never actually done together, because I've been here since she was born. Thomas reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Somehow, having managed to keep it despite the security searches that accompanied every movement of death row inmates. "This is Sophia's latest drawing," he said, holding it up for Elena to see. The drawing was exactly what Elena would expect from a 7-year-old artist. Stick figures representing a family, with Daddy written in purple crayon above a smiling figure lying in what appeared to be a hospital bed. "Get well soon" was written across the top in Sophia's careful printing. "She drew this last week," Thomas explained. Maria told her that Daddy was getting a special treatment this week that might help him feel better. Sophia wanted to make sure I knew she was thinking about me. Elena stared at the drawing, understanding for the first time the full scope of the deception that Maria had maintained to protect her daughters. These children genuinely believed their father was ill, that he was in a hospital receiving treatment, that someday he might come home. "How long have you been planning to ask for this?" Elena asked. "Since the day my appeals were exhausted 3 months ago," Thomas replied. "I've been lying awake every night thinking about Emma and Sophia, about what tomorrow would mean for them. Not just losing their father, but learning that everything they believed about him was a lie." Elena looked at the drawing again, at the innocent hope contained in those purple crayon marks. "Mr. Bennett, even if I wanted to help you, and I'm not saying I do, what you're asking is impossible. Death row executions are witnessed by multiple officials. The process is documented at every step. There's no way to make it appear that you died of natural causes." Thomas nodded slowly. "I know. I've thought about that every night for 3 months. But I had to ask, because not asking felt like giving up on my daughters." Elena stood up and began pacing the small examination room again. Every rational part of her mind was screaming that this conversation needed to end, that she needed to complete her medical evaluation and leave Thomas to face his fate according to the established protocols. But another part of her mind, the part that had become a doctor to heal and protect, was asking different questions. What harm would really be done if 2 little girls were allowed to remember their father as someone who died fighting an illness rather than someone who was executed for murder? What was more important, institutional procedure or protecting innocent children from a truth that would serve no purpose except to cause them pain? "Dr. Rodriguez," Thomas said quietly, "can I ask you something personal?" Elena stopped pacing and looked at him. "Do you have children?" Elena hesitated, knowing that sharing personal information with inmates was discouraged. But something about this moment, about the desperate love she saw in Thomas's eyes, made her answer honestly. "I have 2 daughters," she said. "Rachel is 12 and Carmen is 8. "Then you understand," Thomas said simply. "You understand that there's nothing you wouldn't do to protect them from unnecessary pain." Elena did understand, and that understanding was what made this situation so impossible. As a mother, she could imagine the devastating impact that learning the truth about their father's execution would have on Emma and Sophia. As a doctor, she had sworn to first do no harm. But as a prison medical officer, she was bound by protocols and legal requirements that left no room for the kind of compassion Thomas was asking for. "Mr. Bennett, what you did 8 years ago, the people you killed, do you feel remorse for those crimes?" Thomas met her eyes directly. "Every day of my life, doctor. I was high on methamphetamines when I robbed that convenience store. I never intended to hurt anyone. But when the clerk reached for what I thought was a weapon, I panicked. By the time I realized he was just reaching for the phone, it was too late." Elena had read the details of Thomas's crimes in his file. 2 people had died during his robbery attempt, the store clerk and a customer who had tried to intervene. It was a senseless tragedy born of addiction and desperation, but it was still a tragedy that had destroyed multiple families. "I can't bring back the people I killed," Thomas continued. "I can't undo the pain I caused their families, but I can still protect my daughters from carrying the burden of my mistakes for the rest of their lives." As Elena listened to Thomas speak, she realized that his request wasn't really about falsifying records or breaking protocols. It was about the fundamental question of whether punishment should extend to innocent family members, whether children should be forced to bear the shame of their parents' crimes. "Even if there was a way to help you," Elena said carefully, "it would require multiple people to participate in a deception. I couldn't do it alone." "I know," Thomas said, "and I would never ask anyone else to risk their career or their freedom for me. I just needed to ask you, because not asking felt like failing my daughters one more time." Elena looked at the clock on the wall. It was nearly 4 in the morning. In less than 6 hours, Thomas would be executed, and Emma and Sophia would lose their father. The only question was whether they would lose him to illness or to the justice system. "Mr. Bennett, what exactly do you imagine would happen if I could help you? What would your daughters be told?" Thomas had clearly thought about this in detail. "Maria would tell them that my illness finally became too much for my body to handle, that I died peacefully knowing how much they loved me. They would be able to grieve normally without shame or confusion. They could remember the father who read them bedtime stories during visits, who helped Emma with her science projects over the phone, who encouraged Sophia's artwork. And what about the families of your victims? Don't they deserve to know that justice was served?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "They deserve justice, and they're getting it. I'm going to die for what I did. Whether I die by lethal injection or appear to die of natural causes doesn't change the fact that I'm paying the ultimate price for my crimes." Elena realized that Thomas was right about one thing. His death would occur regardless of how it was officially recorded. The families of his victims would know that he was dead, that he had paid for his crimes. The only people who would be affected by the official cause of death would be Emma and Sophia. "Dr. Rodriguez," Thomas said, "I need to tell you something else, something that might change how you think about my request." Elena sat back down, sensing that whatever Thomas was about to reveal would make her decision even more complicated. "Emma doesn't just want to be a doctor," Thomas continued. "She specifically wants to work in prisons, helping people like me. She told Maria that she wants to be able to help sick people who don't have anyone else to take care of them." Elena felt as if she had been punched in the stomach. Emma, this 9-year-old girl who believed her father was ill, wanted to dedicate her life to helping people in exactly the situation her father was actually in. "She's going to grow up and discover the truth eventually," Elena said weakly. Maybe Thomas agreed. But if she discovers it as an adult, as a doctor herself, she might be able to understand it differently than she would as a 9-year-old child. She might be able to see it as a tragedy rather than as a defining characteristic of who her father was. As Elena sat in that sterile examination room, looking at a drawing made by a 7-year-old who thought her daddy was in the hospital getting better, she realized that Thomas Bennett had presented her with more than just a request for help. He had shown her the difference between justice and mercy, between following rules and protecting innocence, between doing what was required and doing what was right. The clock continued its relentless march toward morning, toward an execution that would end one man's life and forever change the lives of everyone who loved him. And Elena Rodriguez, doctor, mother, and keeper of medical ethics, had to decide whether some lies were more important than any truth. You know what they don't tell you in medical school about the weight of impossible decisions. They teach you about life and death choices, about emergency situations where you have seconds to save someone. But they don't teach you about the slow, agonizing decisions that unfold over hours, where saving someone might mean sacrificing everything you've worked for your entire career. Elena stared at Sophia's drawing, at the simple crayon representation of a family that was about to be shattered. The purple stick figure labeled Daddy smiled up at her from the paper, blissfully unaware that in less than 5 hours, the real Daddy would be strapped to a gurney receiving lethal injections while witnesses watched through a one-way window. "Mr. Bennett," Elena said finally, "what you're asking me to do could destroy my medical license, end my career, and possibly send me to prison. You're asking me to commit fraud, to violate my professional oath, to participate in a conspiracy that involves falsifying official government documents." Thomas nodded solemnly. "I know, and I hate myself for even asking. But I also know that in 5 hours I'll be dead, and Emma and Sophia will spend the rest of their lives carrying the shame of having a father who was executed by the state." Elena stood up and walked to the small window again, looking out at the pre-dawn darkness that covered the prison yard. Somewhere out there, 3 hours away, 2 little girls were sleeping peacefully in their beds, unaware that this would be the last morning they woke up with a father. "Even if I wanted to help you," she said without turning around, "I don't see how it would be possible. There are too many people involved, too many documents, too many witnesses. What if there was a way?" Thomas asked quietly. Elena turned back to face him, surprised by something in his tone that suggested this wasn't just desperate wishful thinking. "What do you mean?" Thomas took a deep breath, as if preparing to reveal something he had been planning for months. "What if I could create a medical emergency that required immediate intervention? Something that would require you to attempt life-saving measures that ultimately failed." Elena felt a chill run down her spine. "You're talking about suicide." "I'm talking about a medical crisis that occurs before the scheduled execution," Thomas corrected. "If I were to suffer a heart attack or stroke, if my condition deteriorated rapidly despite your best efforts to save me, if I died of natural causes while under medical care rather than during the execution procedure." Elena realized that Thomas had thought about this in far more detail than she had initially understood. He wasn't just asking her to falsify records after the fact. He was proposing a scenario where the records would technically be accurate, where she would genuinely be attempting to save his life when he died. How, she asked, though she immediately regretted the question. Thomas reached into his mouth and pulled out what appeared to be a small white pill, somehow hidden despite the thorough searches that preceded his movement to the medical wing. "I've been saving medication for 3 months, he said. "Heart medication from other inmates, anxiety medication, blood pressure pills. I've been hiding them, collecting them, waiting for tonight." Elena stared at the pill in Thomas's hand, understanding that she was looking at his suicide plan. He had spent months preparing for this moment, gathering the means to end his life on his own terms rather than the state's. If I take these pills during our examination, I'll go into cardiac arrest within minutes. You would be required to attempt resuscitation, to try everything in your power to save me. When those attempts failed, the cause of death would be listed as cardiac arrest due to drug overdose, not lethal injection. The plan was both simple and horrifying. Thomas would essentially commit suicide during his medical examination, and Elena would be unable to save him despite her best efforts. To any outside observer, it would appear that an inmate had taken his own life, and a dedicated doctor had fought unsuccessfully to preserve it. Mr. Bennett, what you're describing is still suicide. Your daughters would still grow up knowing their father killed himself rather than died of natural illness. Thomas shook his head. Not if you were to describe my death differently in your medical report. Not if you were to emphasize the underlying health conditions that made me vulnerable to cardiac arrest, the stress of facing execution, the deterioration of my mental and physical state. Elena realized that Thomas was asking her to craft a narrative that would allow Maria to tell Emma and Sophia that their father's heart had simply given out under the stress of his illness and treatment. It wouldn't be entirely false. Thomas was under enormous stress. He was facing execution. His death would technically be due to cardiac arrest. But it would also be a carefully constructed version of the truth designed to protect two children from the full horror of their father's final choice. Even if I agreed to this insane plan, Elena said, which I haven't, there would still be an investigation. Inmates don't just die of sudden cardiac arrest without extensive examination of the circumstances. But inmates do sometimes die of medical emergencies, Thomas replied. Especially inmates under extreme stress who have access to various medications. The investigation would focus on how I obtained the drugs, not on whether you had done everything possible to save me. Elena realized that Thomas was right about one thing. Death row inmates did occasionally die of natural causes or medical emergencies before their scheduled executions. While such events were investigated, they weren't unheard of, especially when the inmate was under the enormous psychological stress of facing imminent death. And you've thought about what this would mean for me, for my career, my reputation, my family. Thomas's expression became infinitely sad. Dr. Rodriguez, I would never ask you to do anything that would put you at serious risk. The worst thing that could happen to you professionally would be questions about whether you could have done more to save me. But given the circumstances, an inmate facing execution in a few hours, sudden cardiac arrest due to drug overdose, no one would question your efforts or your competence. Elena walked back to her chair and sat down, her mind reeling with the implications of what Thomas was proposing. From a purely medical perspective, his plan would probably work. She would have plausible deniability, a legitimate medical emergency to respond to, and a clear cause of death that wouldn't implicate her in any wrongdoing. But from an ethical perspective, she would be participating in an elaborate deception designed to spare two children from learning the truth about their father's crimes and execution. Mr. Bennett, why me? Why are you asking me to be part of this instead of someone else? Thomas met her eyes directly. Because in the 2 years you've been providing my medical care, you've treated me like a human being instead of just an inmate. Because when I told you about Emma wanting to be a doctor, I saw something in your eyes that told me you understood what it meant to love a child enough to sacrifice anything for them. Elena thought about her own daughters, about Rachel and Carmen sleeping safely in their beds, while she sat in this examination room faced with an impossible choice. What would she want someone to do for her daughters if she were in Thomas's position? What level of protection would she want for them from the harsh realities of adult consequences and failures? "There's something else," Thomas said quietly. "Something I haven't told you about why this is so important to me." Elena looked at him, wondering what additional revelation could possibly make this situation more complicated. "Emma's birthday is next week. She's turning 10. For the past 3 years, Maria has been promising her that maybe Daddy would be healthy enough to come home for her birthday. That maybe the doctors would finally figure out how to make him better." Elena felt tears threatening her eyes as she imagined this little girl who had been hoping for years that her father would recover from his mysterious illness in time to celebrate her birthday. "If I die in an execution tomorrow, Maria will have to tell Emma on her 10th birthday that Daddy is never coming home because he wasn't really sick. He was actually a criminal who was put to death by the government. But if I die tonight, if I die of natural causes related to my illness, Maria can tell Emma that Daddy tried to hold on until her birthday, but his heart just wasn't strong enough." The additional layer of tragedy, that Emma's birthday would forever be associated with learning the truth about her father's death, was almost too much for Elena to bear. "Dr. Rodriguez, I'm not asking you to help me commit suicide. I'm asking you to help me die in a way that protects my daughters from carrying the burden of my crimes for the rest of their lives. I'm asking you to let me be their daddy who fought bravely against illness rather than their father who was executed for murder." As Elena sat in that examination room holding Sophia's drawing of her family, she realized that Thomas Bennett had presented her with a choice that went far beyond medical ethics or legal protocols. He had asked her to choose between truth and mercy, between institutional loyalty and protecting innocence, between following rules and following her heart. The clock on the wall showed that dawn was approaching, that in just a few hours, one way or another, Thomas Bennett would be dead. The only question was how his daughters would remember him, and whether Elena Rodriguez would risk everything she had worked for to give a condemned man the death he believed his children deserved. The weight of that choice pressed down on her shoulders like a physical force as she looked into the eyes of a father who loved his daughters more than his own life. Sometimes, the most important decisions in our lives happen in moments when we have no time to think, no chance to consult others, no opportunity to weigh all the consequences. They happen when our hearts and our minds are at war, and we have to choose which voice to follow into an uncertain future. Elena looked at the small white pill in Thomas's hand, understanding that she was staring at the instrument of his planned death. Everything about the situation was wrong: the request, the circumstances, the impossible choice she was being asked to make. But as she thought about Emma and Sophia, about 2 innocent children who would wake up tomorrow in a world forever changed, she found herself considering the unthinkable. "If I were to agree to this," Elena said slowly, "which I'm not saying I am, what exactly would happen?" Thomas closed his fist around the pill, his knuckles white with the tension of holding his own death in his palm. "I would take the medication during our examination. Within 10 to 15 minutes, I would go into cardiac arrest. You would immediately begin resuscitation efforts, CPR, defibrillation, emergency medications. You would do everything a skilled emergency physician would do to save my life." Elena found herself mentally running through the emergency protocols, imagining the scene that would unfold in this small examination room. "When your efforts failed, when I died despite your intervention, the cause of death would be cardiac arrest due to drug overdose. An investigation would be conducted, but it would focus on how I obtained the drugs, not on your medical response. And your daughters? Maria would be notified that I had died unexpectedly of heart failure related to the stress of my illness. Emma and Sophia would be told that Daddy's heart just couldn't fight anymore, that he died peacefully knowing how much they loved him. Elena realized that Thomas's plan would technically involve telling the truth, just not the complete truth. He would die of heart failure. His heart would stop fighting. The stress of his situation would be a contributing factor. The girls could be told these facts without being told about the execution, the suicide, the deliberate overdose. Mr. Bennett, what you're asking me to do is participate in your suicide while pretending to try to save your life. I'm asking you to do your job as a doctor when a patient suffers a medical emergency, Thomas corrected. I'm asking you to respond professionally and competently to a cardiac arrest, even if that arrest was self-induced. Elena stood up and began pacing again, her mind racing through the medical, ethical, and legal implications of what Thomas was proposing. As a doctor, she was sworn to preserve life whenever possible, but she was also sworn to relieve suffering, and wasn't the lifetime of pain that Emma and Sophia would endure if they learned the truth about their father a form of suffering that she had the power to prevent. There would be an autopsy, she said. The medical examiner would discover the drugs in your system. Yes, but drug overdoses among death row inmates aren't unheard of. The assumption would be that I had obtained medication illicitly and taken it deliberately, either as a suicide attempt or as a way to avoid execution. The focus would be on the security failure that allowed me access to the drugs, not on the medical response. Elena realized that Thomas was probably right. Inmates did sometimes obtain contraband medications, and they did sometimes attempt suicide rather than face execution. While such incidents were investigated, they didn't typically result in blame being assigned to medical personnel who had responded appropriately to the emergency. And you've been planning this for months. Every detail, Thomas confirmed. I've thought about the timing, the medications, the likely response protocols. I've even practiced what I would say to you during the examination to make sure you had time to prepare for the emergency. The level of planning that Thomas had put into his own death was both impressive and heartbreaking. He had spent months preparing not just to die, but to die in a way that would protect his children from the truth about who he was. Dr. Rodriguez, Thomas said, can I tell you something about the night I committed my crimes? Elena sat back down, sensing that Thomas was about to reveal something that would make her decision even more complicated. I was high on methamphetamines, desperate for money to buy more drugs. I chose that convenience store because it was small, because I thought it would be an easy target. But when I walked in and saw the clerk, a young man about my age, I almost walked back out. Thomas's voice became heavy with remorse as he continued. His name tag said David, and he had pictures of his family taped to the register. A young woman and a little girl, maybe 3 years old. When I pulled out the gun, when I demanded money, David looked at those pictures, and I could see him thinking about his wife and daughter. Elena realized that Thomas was describing the moment when his crime had become personal, when the abstract act of robbery had become the concrete reality of threatening a father who was trying to protect his family's future. When David reached for what I thought was a weapon, when I shot him, the first thing I thought about wasn't getting caught or going to prison. It was that little girl in the picture and how she was going to grow up without her daddy because of what I had done. Thomas wiped tears from his eyes before continuing. Emma was only a year old when I was arrested. Sophia wasn't even born yet. For 8 years I've been thinking about David's daughter, about how my actions destroyed her family. And I've been thinking about my own daughters, about how my actions were going to destroy their understanding of who their father was. Elena felt the weight of understanding settle over her. Thomas wasn't just asking her to help him avoid execution. He was asking her to help him find a form of redemption that the justice system couldn't provide. Dr. Rodriguez, I can't bring David back to his daughter. I can't undo the pain I caused his family. But I can prevent my daughters from carrying the burden of my crimes. I can die in a way that lets them remember love instead of shame. Elena looked at the clock. 3 hours until the scheduled execution. 3 hours to make a decision that would either save 2 children from a lifetime of trauma or make her complicit in an elaborate deception that violated everything she had been taught about medical ethics. If I were to help you, Elena said carefully, there could be consequences we haven't considered. What if the investigation goes deeper? What if someone suspects that your death wasn't entirely natural? Thomas met her eyes with surprising calm. Then I will have died trying to protect my daughters, and you will have tried to save the life of a patient in medical distress. Neither of us would have anything to be ashamed of. Elena realized that Thomas had given this decision a moral framework that transcended legal technicalities. From his perspective, they wouldn't be committing fraud, they would be participating in an act of love that happened to require careful presentation of the facts. Mr. Bennett, if I agree to this, I need you to understand that once you take that medication, I will do everything in my power to save your life. I won't be pretending to resuscitate you, I'll be genuinely trying to keep you alive. I understand, Thomas said quietly. And I hope you succeed, but if you don't, if my heart stops despite your efforts, then at least Emma and Sophia will be able to grieve their father without being ashamed of him. Elena stood up one final time, walking to the window that looked out on the pre-dawn sky. In a few hours, the sun would rise on a world where Thomas Bennett was dead. The only question was whether his daughters would remember him as a victim of illness or a victim of justice. She thought about her own daughters, about how she would want them to remember her if she faced Thomas's situation. She thought about the Hippocratic Oath, about doing no harm, about whether protecting innocent children from devastating truth constituted harm or healing. When she turned back to Thomas, Elena had made her decision. Mr. Bennett, I want you to know that what you're asking goes against my training, my professional obligations, and probably the law. But it doesn't go against my conscience as a mother or my duty as a healer. Thomas's eyes filled with tears of gratitude and relief. Before you do this, Elena continued, I need you to tell me everything about Emma and Sophia. I need to understand exactly who I'm trying to protect. For the next hour, as dawn approached outside the examination room window, Thomas told Elena about his daughters, about Emma's dream of becoming a doctor, about her kindness to animals and her love of science, about Sophia's artistic talents, her infectious laugh, her habit of drawing pictures of the family she had never really known. He told her about Maria, his ex-wife, who had sacrificed her own peace of mind to maintain an elaborate fiction that protected their children, about the visits where Emma would explain her school projects and Sophia would show off her latest drawings, while Thomas pretended to be getting better in his special hospital. As Thomas spoke, Elena realized that she wasn't just helping a condemned man die peacefully. She was helping preserve a love story that had survived 8 years of separation, incarceration, and approaching death. At 5:30 in the morning, 90 minutes before his scheduled execution, Thomas Bennett looked at Dr. Elena Rodriguez and said, I'm ready. Elena checked her medical equipment one final time, ensuring that she had everything necessary to respond to a cardiac emergency. Defibrillator, emergency medications, resuscitation equipment. Everything she would need to fight for Thomas's life, even knowing that the fight was likely already lost. Dr. Rodriguez, Thomas said as he prepared to take the pills he had saved for 3 months. Will you promise me something? What? If you ever meet Emma when she becomes a doctor, if your paths cross in a hospital or medical conference someday, will you tell her that her father died proud of the woman she became? Elena felt tears streaming down her face as she nodded. I promise. Thomas smiled, placed Sophia's drawing on the examination table where Elena could see it, and put the pills in his mouth. What happened next would forever change Elena's understanding of what it meant to be a healer. As Thomas went into cardiac arrest, as she fought desperately to save his life, as his heart finally stopped despite her efforts, Elena realized that sometimes the greatest medical intervention is not saving a life, but allowing someone to die with dignity. 6 months later, Dr. Elena Rodriguez received a letter in the mail. The return address showed it was from Maria Bennett, and Elena's hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a thank you card with a drawing on the front, Sophia's artwork showing a family of angels watching over 2 little girls. The message inside was brief but devastating in its gratitude. Dr. Rodriguez, Emma and Sophia wanted me to thank you for taking such good care of their daddy in his final days. They draw pictures of him in heaven now, and they talk about how proud he would be that Emma still wants to be a doctor like you. Thank you for helping them remember love instead of loss. Enclosed with the card were 2 school photos. Emma, now 10, wearing a white coat from career day at school, and Sophia, 8, holding a crayon drawing of a doctor helping sick people. Elena had never told anyone what really happened in that examination room on the morning Thomas Bennett died of cardiac arrest. The investigation had concluded exactly as Thomas had predicted, that an inmate facing execution had obtained contraband medication and died despite appropriate medical intervention. Elena's response had been praised by prison administration and medical supervisors. She had followed protocol perfectly, fought to save Thomas's life with skill and determination, and documented everything appropriately. No questions were asked about her competence or her judgment. But late at night, when Elena couldn't sleep, she would think about those final moments in the examination room, about how hard she had actually tried to save Thomas's life, despite knowing what he wanted, about how her medical training had kicked in automatically, forcing her to fight death, even when death might have been a mercy. She had genuinely tried to resuscitate him. The irony was that Thomas Bennett, in choosing to die protecting his daughters, had also chosen to trust Elena Rodriguez to save him, if possible. His final act had been one of faith in her abilities as a doctor, even as he prepared for those abilities to fail. Elena had kept her promise to Thomas in an unexpected way. 3 months after his death, she had established a scholarship fund for children of incarcerated parents who wanted to pursue medical careers. The Emma Bennett Memorial Scholarship would help other children like Emma achieve their dreams of becoming healers. Emma didn't know about the scholarship that bore her name. She didn't know that her father's death had inspired a program that would help dozens of other children pursue medical education. She simply knew that her daddy had fought bravely against his illness and died believing in her dreams. As Elena looked at Sophia's drawing of angel families, she realized that Thomas Bennett had achieved something remarkable in his final hours. He had transformed his death from an ending into a beginning, from a moment of justice into an act of love, from a tragedy that would destroy his children into a story that would sustain them. The 2 little girls who had lost their father still grieved, but they grieved with dignity rather than shame. They remembered bedtime stories instead of news reports, hospital visits instead of prison bars, a daddy who loved them enough to fight illness rather than a father who had been executed for murder. Elena had learned something profound about medicine in that examination room. Sometimes healing doesn't mean saving a life. Sometimes it means allowing someone to die in a way that preserves what they loved most. Sometimes the greatest medical intervention is protecting innocence, even when protection requires participating in a carefully constructed version of the truth. Thomas Bennett had died as he lived his final years, thinking of Emma and Sophia first, putting their well-being above his own, loving them enough to sacrifice everything for their peace of mind. And Elena Rodriguez had learned that sometimes the most important oath a doctor can take isn't the Hippocratic Oath, it's the promise to help a parent protect their children, even when that protection requires walking into the gray areas between truth and mercy. What would you have done in Elena's place? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that will challenge everything you think you know about right and wrong, justice and mercy, truth and love.